Hello and welcome back. This is the week 14 lecture. So today I would like us to really get into Blake. I just sort of offered a general overview last week. And like I said, I was assuming that a lot of us were still finishing up Whitman last week and maybe some of those supplemental texts that I put in the week 13 module. So here in week 14, hopefully we've all at least gotten started on Blake. I don't necessarily expect us to be finished, and I don't necessarily expect us to even be on to part 2 yet. So this week we're just going to focus on part 1. And then I'm thinking next week I'll break my lecture into 2 parts, and part 1 will conclude the novel. We will cover part 2 of the novel, and then part 2 of my lecture will cover Circumstance, which is the final required reading. It's the only new text that I'm going to put in the week 15 module. So we'll take a look at that, and that's how we will finish this semester in terms of content. I'll take a little bit of time, maybe in that second part of the week 15 lecture, just to talk briefly about the final exam. But I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time on it once you've looked at the sample exam and then once you look at my study guide. So that'll be next week. This week, I'll try to keep it a little bit short. I know a lot of us are working on the critical summaries and proposals. I talked about that assignment last week. Please let me know if you have any questions about it. It is, of course, due at the end of this week. So I just want to tackle part 1, and then we will save part 2 for later, for next week. So I want to return to some things that we were talking about last week. I mentioned this sort of weird push and pull that takes place in Blake between the rhetorical purposes of the novel and what we might define or consider as the more sort of narrative-minded impulses. So, like I said, and McGann talks about this in the critical intro, for a long time, Delany was considered by many critics and lit scholars as being just a bad novelist. And a lot of people thought that he really wasn't all that interested in creating a realistic work of fiction. But we've begun to reevaluate that assessment a little bit, and I think McGann sort of gestures towards some of the changes to our perception. And one thing that we're beginning to realize, or one thing that gets talked about more now with Delany, is that there are times where he is able to create incredibly realistic portraits of Southern life, African American life in the South during this time period. So even though I would argue that the narrative purposes are not always his priority, and developing character and utilizing literary language might not always be the number one priority, I would argue that oftentimes it is. And particularly in part 1. Part 1 is in many ways more conventional, more expected, perhaps, than what we see in part 2. In many ways, part 1 conforms to the typical rhythms and conventions of popular fiction of this time. So we're going to see today there might be a few elements of sentimental fiction. We've already talked about some of those. We're also going to see elements of ethnography, sort of, pseudo-social science. So he's actually bringing together a lot of different elements, a lot of different writing styles. There's certainly social commentary here, but a lot of what we see, at least in part 1, does look and sound a lot like a pretty conventional novel. But then in part 2, things turn and things change and get even stranger. And we have this weird mashup of historical figures, the continued presence of fictional or narrative elements, and then we also get more of the sort of didactic stuff that McGann talks about in the critical intro, and I mentioned some of this last time. Again, there's a real rhetorical goal here, right? This idea that Delany, not really being a fiction writer by trade, he's largely using this work of literature to make a larger argument about black emancipation, about really the development of a new African American consciousness, this commitment to personal freedom that he's trying to sort of convey here. So he has argumentative purposes, he has larger social purposes, and we talked last week about his plan for black immigration going back to Africa. So there's even a practical level here where he's making this argument, he's raising money, he's advocating this immigration plan as a way for black Americans to finally find their freedom. So there's a lot going on that sort of supersedes perhaps some of these fictional or narrative aspects. But again, he's not neglecting the fictional or narrative aspects all the time. And in part one, and I want to look at some of these parts today, some of these passages where we really do see a commitment to realism, to certain, observing certain social conditions. He is engaged in some similar activities to what we might have seen with sentimental novelists as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more today about, sort of these elements of fiction, these things that would have been familiar based on the popular fiction, popular novels of the time. And then next week, things might get a little stranger as we sort of depart from a lot of these conventions that we see early on. And really the book becomes something a bit different in part two. So we'll save that discussion for next time. But another thing I mentioned last week was that, Delany, as the son of an enslaved father, as somebody who obviously had relatives and, some direct knowledge of slavery, though he was never a slave himself, Delany's able to offer a sort of greater level of detail, a more granular level of detail and realism than what a lot of white authors would have been able to provide. So a book that often gets classified along with Blake or sort of compared to Blake is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. I mentioned that book last week. It was the bestseller in the 1850s that finally eclipsed Charlotte Temple, the first American bestseller written by Susanna Rowson back in the 1790s. So another example of a sentimental novel. So we talked about some of those earlier sentimental novels from the 1790s, The Coquette being one. But I also mentioned Uncle Tom's Cabin, different in terms of subject matter compared to those earlier seduction tales, but still designed to elicit strong emotions, to provoke sympathy, to create that right feeling, that sort of moral instruction that sentimental fiction was supposed to provide. We're invited to feel sympathy for the characters that we see. We're invited to sort of put ourselves in other people's shoes, understand suffering, hardships, and it's supposed to make us perhaps want to help, or at the very least, it broadens our perspective and it gives us a greater appreciation for what other people are going through. That's what sentimental fiction is supposed to do. And a lot of people look at Uncle Tom's Cabin and say, well, she succeeded because that book had a very powerful abolitionist message. It depicted the horrors of slavery, and people responded to it in a very strong, sort of visceral way. But like I mentioned, Stowe is a white woman from Massachusetts. I don't know if she probably visited the South at some point, but she didn't have the kind of firsthand knowledge or the firsthand experience that Delany had. So what Delany does that I find really interesting, and a big reason why a lot of scholars and critics find this book interesting today, is because he's really giving us a glimpse, a close look at very peculiar, specific cultural practices that would have been found in the antebellum South, in slave-holding cultures, in general, but he's showing us things. He's showing aspects of this culture that a lot of American readers would not have been familiar with. This was stuff that did not appear in a ton of popular fiction of the time. So yes, Stowe is depicting similar things. She has some similar subject matter, but she also focuses quite a bit on her white characters. And it's still, at the end of the day, a white perspective. Delaney gives us, obviously, an African American perspective, so the book is different in that regard. But also, perhaps more importantly, what he's doing is sort of showing things that a lot of other writers of the time would not have shown, either because they didn't have knowledge of it, or because, frankly, they just didn't want to talk about it. So even, popular literature produced in the South, some of this stuff might have shown up there, but African Americans were often effaced in that fiction. They might have turned up in small roles, usually as contented slaves. In a lot of the old Southwestern humor, African American characters were often not very present, just like Native American characters were often not very present. And if they were there, again, they were in small roles and they were occupying servile positions, and they were certainly not the focus of the narrative. So we're going to learn some things in part one about slaveholding culture, Southern culture, but also about African American culture. But again, something that would not have been very familiar or well known to a lot of white readers in the antebellum period. So remember, this book is getting published serially between 1859 and 1862. But as McGann says in the critical intro, very few people probably read it upon its initial publication. It really would not be discovered and for another 100 years, really, until around the middle of the 20th century. But Delaney is obviously drawing on certain literary traditions and just certain cultural practices that would have been common throughout the middle portion of the 19th century in America, particularly in the southern U.S. So I wanted to take a look at a couple of examples of this, specifically thinking about patrols and sprees. These are concepts that we sort of get introduced to in chapter 21, which is entitled Whatnot. I believe this begins on page 89 if you have my edition. So I actually wanted to go to this chapter and just take a look. It's kind of a subtle scene, but I think it carries a lot of importance, and it's doing multiple things. Like I said, it's giving us this kind of documentary evidence, this really granular detail about everyday life in the South under this oppressive system from the experience or perspective of African American characters. So we're learning about a custom or a practice that was unique to this place that, again, might not have been widely known to a lot of readers. So if you flip to page 89, that's where the chapter begins. But I actually want us to jump ahead to page 93. So just to provide a little quick context, this is early in Henry's journey. So he's kind of traveling through the Southeast. I mentioned this last week, and we're going to talk more about this section of the book. He's traveling through the Southeast at this point, trying to recruit potential members to participate in his planned insurrection. So this is kind of the ethnographic section of the book, where he's traveling through the South and he's recording sort of his experiences and his observations about all the different types of enslaved people that he meets. So we get really specific characteristics and traits of all of these different kinds of slaves that he meets during his travels. So we'll talk more about that, but that's what he's doing here at this point. Remember, Colonel Frank's plantation where he lives, that's in Mississippi. So by this point, early in his travels, he's gone to Arkansas, which, he's not far, but he's like, I think, crossed the Mississippi, and he's in Arkansas, not too far from his home, but a different state. A slightly different part of the South. And one thing that we see over the course of his travels is that in different parts of the South, slaves have different characteristics, there are slightly different customs or cultures, and there are different slave laws. There are different customs regulating the institution of slavery, and that all matters to him for sort of a practical reason, right? Because he's trying to figure out who's going to help him and sort of how they're going to pull off this insurrection. He's trying to put everything together, so he needs to know kind of, who is best equipped to aid him and what areas might produce the most skilled insurrectionists and the conditions most needed to get this thing started. So there's a real practical value to the ethnographic observations that he's providing. And yeah, he kind of engages in some stereotyping, as we're going to see, but those observations are interesting, and I just think his whole journey through the South itself is quite interesting. So he's just started it. He's in Arkansas, and he's visiting Aunt Rachel and Uncle Jerry, this elderly couple, this slave couple, and he is visiting with them in their cabin or their hut, their modest home. And this is really interesting because, again, without really announcing it or calling a lot of attention to it, Delaney is showing us social conditions of this time and place. And again, these were social conditions that weren't always on display. Like I said, in a lot of fiction written by white Southern authors, if black characters appeared at all, they were going to appear as contented slaves. And we weren't going to get a close look at the sort of thing that we see here. So if you look on page 93, you'll notice that a small party of white men arrives at Rachel and Jerry's home. So this is referred to as a gentleman patrol. This is a slave patrol. And this is one of those concepts that might have been dimly understood by white readers outside of the South, but it wasn't widely known or really spoken about. Like I mentioned last week with slave insurrections, people knew about them. People talked about them, but they often weren't considered to be appropriate subjects of conversation in polite company. And I would say things like slave patrols probably would have fallen under that same header. They were known in the South. They were talked about. Some people had seen them or experienced them or knew them, but it's a little bit unsavory, a little bit not fit, for that polite company. So the idea is basically these are groups of white men, just sort of local citizens, who get together and they go on these evening patrols to basically police the local slave population. So as we learn here, there's normally curfews in place for enslaved people, so they can't be out past a certain hour. But the details, the nature of these laws and these curfews vary from state to state, as Henry experiences. So Henry is not known around these parts. So when these white men show up unannounced at Rachel's house and demand to be admitted, they immediately see Rachel and Jerry, who they know, and they're obviously familiar with those two as longtime residents of the area, but then they also notice Henry, and they don't recognize Henry. So they say, "Oh, who are you? Who do you belong to?" Of course, assuming that he's a slave, and he plays along. Remember, and we're going to return to this later, Henry was not born into slavery. He was born free and was later decoyed or tricked into being sold into slavery. But it seems like he's become free yet again, but he continues to live on the Franks plantation for the sake of his wife, who is enslaved. So Henry, as we're going to see, is quite a bit different from most of the other slave characters in the book. But he has to pretend to be a slave from a nearby plantation in Louisiana. And that's what he tells the patrol. Oh, I'm just visiting. I'm from Louisiana. And that helps to explain why he's still at Rachel and Jerry's house. Because apparently in Louisiana, the curfew for slaves is much later than the curfew is in Arkansas. So they kind of give him a pass because he doesn't know the local customs and rules. Apparently things are a bit more permissive in Louisiana. So notice the way that Delaney is sort of describing this area here. We're in Arkansas, which is described as kind of a frontier region. So think about what we were discussing a few weeks ago with Old Southwestern humor. And remember, these parts of the South, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, northern Louisiana, the part that wasn't so much under French control, western Tennessee, all of these parts of the South got settled a lot later than the old colonial or seaboard South, which is usually defined as Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Those were all colonies, right? Those have all been around for a long time. But what we see in those, southern states further to the west is sort of a later settlement. And, Native American conflict lasts longer in those places. Things are a little bit more unsettled. In some people's eyes, almost barbaric, kind of backwoods conditions, fewer aspects of kind of civilized white society and what people would have thought of as that at that time. So again, more sort of frontier conditions, not as many laws, anything goes, a little bit more violent, a little bit less stable. By the time the Civil War rolls around, a lot of those kinds of frontier aspects had sort of gone away. They might have been found in a few parts of Missouri or Arkansas, like up in the Ozarks, or a few really remote places. But by the time the Civil War breaks out, the South has become a little bit more of a coherent, consistent entity. But in the decades leading up to the Civil War, there would have been a pretty distinct difference between the Southern cultures that we find in the old seaboard South versus the old Southwest. And we are very much in the old Southwest here in Arkansas. So it's a little bit lawless, it's a little bit wild. But we learn that this patrol that shows up, this slave patrol, is composed of the better class of persons, according to Delaney's narrator. And this is on page, I think, 94. Principally businessmen, two of whom being lawyers, who went out that evening for a mere frolic among the Negroes. That's the phrase that appears in the text, a frolic among the Negroes. And then later we hear one of the characters refer to what they're doing that night as a spree among the Negroes. So a spree or a frolic, these are terms that suggest fun, merrymaking, pleasure, leisure activities. So that's what's kind of weird and interesting about what's going on here. On one hand, this is a slave patrol, in some ways kind of the precursor to a lot of our notions of sort of modern police force, policing or law enforcement. They're deputized to go out there and find any potential runaway slaves or slaves that are breaking the rules. So they have a practical function within the social structure of the time and place. But we also get the impression that these guys are just out for a lark. They're out for a good time. So maybe once they've made their rounds and they've confirmed that there's no slaves out past curfew, then they shift gears. And it's about drinking, it's about sport, it's about fun. And as we read on in the chapter, we see what one of these frolics or sprees looks like. And it's only fun for the white guys, as we can imagine. So, but before we get there, I want to stay in Rachel's house for a moment and just notice what happens after the gentleman patrol shows up. So they question Henry, and once they're satisfied that he's just from Louisiana and he's going to go back to his master's plantation soon, we notice that Rachel is like, oh, well, can he get a little bit of dinner before he goes? Like, can I give him some food for the road? And that gets the white guys to thinking about dinner. So at the bottom of 93 and the top of 94, they discover what Rachel has prepared for dinner, what she has prepared for, herself and Jerry and Henry. Spare rib and ash cake. And she's tried to hide it, but they find it. And once they find it, notice what happens immediately afterwards. What's better? Rachel, give us some seats here. This is Ralph Jordan, who's kind of the ringleader, it would appear, of this particular patrol. So notice that the white guys proceed to sit down and eat all the food that Rachel had prepared for herself and her husband and their friend Henry. Notice that the white men don't ask if they can have any. There's no please, there's no thank you. They're entitled to it. And this seems to be accepted by everyone. There's no protest from Rachel, and you can tell that she expected this very thing, or she was afraid of this happening because she tried to hide the food. She knew if they saw the food, they were going to eat it. So this is just custom. This is just the way things work. So this is an interesting scene. We're about to see much more violence, much more brutality. We already have seen violence and brutality by this point in the narrative. So it's not like Delaney doesn't show us that part of the system, but here we see a slightly different type of racism or oppression. It's not necessarily violent. It's not necessarily as confrontational, perhaps, as what we might see elsewhere. It's more of a kind of soft oppression. It's the oppression of social expectations and a certain social structure that always puts white men at the top, no matter what. They're guests in this home, but they don't really have to conduct themselves like guests. Anything in the home is potentially theirs, right? They can claim anything. They can come and go as they please. They can question who they please. And just their whole attitude, right? They're kind of on friendly terms with Rachel and Jerry. But there's no give and take necessarily. They are in the superior position and they get to take what they want. So again, this scene is not violent or terrifying, but it demonstrates the oppression of the time and place all the same. The white men can just help themselves. And again, notice that Delaney's narrator points out that these are the better class of men, that this is a good patrol, just in terms of the types of people that make it up. These are kind of white-collar professionals, a couple of lawyers. They're not ruffians. They're not, bandits or roughnecks. So the implication is things could be worse. Potentially. They could be, more violent. They could be more aggressive if they were a different type of person, if they were a different class of patrol. So it's almost like Rachel and Jerry and Henry are getting off easy because these guys are at least not overly violent. But they take what they want, and then on their way out, notice that they try to give Jerry and Rachel a few items to kind of make up for the meal that they've just eaten. But again, notice the detail that Delaney provides. This is about halfway down page 94. Rising from the homely but palatable and substantial meal at the humble board of Aunt Rachel and Uncle Jerry, they emptied their pockets of crackers, cold biscuits and cheese, giving the old man a plug of honey-cured tobacco to be divided between himself and his wife, in lieu of what they had, without invitation, taken the liberty of eating. And again, in the very next sentence there of that passage, we hear, again, this patrol was composed of the better class of persons, including a couple of lawyers who are simply out for a frolic among the Negroes. So again, we can read this passage in a lot of ways. I think it's just a nice instance of realism, a really accurate, detail-oriented portrait of a particular type of social interaction that, again, would seem rather strange to most readers outside of the South, or most readers who did not have experience living in a slave-holding culture. So Delaney gives us this kind of insight and this kind of firsthand glimpse without being overly sort of showy or demonstrative about it. But there's this kind of latent fear that I always pick up on when the patrol shows up. Again, they're in pretty good spirits and they're not even too mad about Henry being there past curfew, but there's always this threat, this implicit threat, that if Rachel refuses to feed them, or if Henry takes a sort of insolent tone, that violence could very well be the answer. And if it was a different kind of patrol composed of different kinds of people, violence could very well be on the table. But before we, let these particular members of the patrol off the hook, let's take a look at what they're doing later in the chapter. So later on, we get a little bit more detail about what one of these frolics or sprees really looks like. So again, the night seems to begin for the patrol on official business. They're making their rounds, they're making sure no slaves are out past curfew. But then, when the work is done, it's time to eat, it's time to drink some Jamaican rum, like they're doing at Rachel's, and it's time to have fun. And that's what they start doing after they leave Rachel's. And Henry, unfortunately, encounters them again under very different circumstances. So later in the chapter, we realize that the sport that these men are engaging in on this particular evening is to watch as this guy, Colonel Sprout, who's a character that would have very much been at home in a work of old Southwestern humor, Colonel Sprout turns his dogs loose to basically hunt unsuspecting black victims. And this is sport. This is the frolic, right? They're drinking, they're probably placing bets, and they're watching as they essentially torture and pursue any unfortunate black person who might come along. So I think the logic here is this could be a way to perhaps capture runaway slaves, but also if a slave is just kind of on a mission sent by a master, it's all the same, right? It doesn't matter at this point if the slave has done anything wrong or is violating curfew. It's just sport. It's just like watching dogs pursue any other type of game. So this is a very important moment too. This is the bookend. So we see how the patrol is functioning kind of earlier in the night. I wouldn't quite say polite. I wouldn't quite say kind, but sort of good humor. They're eating all of Rachel's food, but at least they're not overtly cruel about it, I guess, if we want to find something positive to say. But then those same guys, Ralph Jordan and the other guys, later on, they're enjoying that particular sport with Colonel Sprout. And it's all just a big lark for them. It's fun. It's amusing. It's entertainment. And of course, Henry happens to be in the area, so the dogs end up pursuing him. And I think he kills them. Sort of in self-defense. But this would have been something that, would have been fairly common for the time and the place. And we see other examples earlier in the narrative in chapter 16. We see Colonel Franks and his friends enjoy that really difficult to read passage. We see them enjoy I guess you would call it a performance put on by a young slave as the slave is being whipped. And again, that's amusing to Colonel Franks, and his friends. That's something to do for entertainment value. So I think, Delaney's definitely showing us how slavery, it has many negative effects, obviously, but one thing we observe is how it sort of dehumanizes and perhaps sort of creates monstrous tendencies on the part of the people who own slaves. It makes them kind of morally bankrupt in various ways and perhaps unaware of the depths of their own depravity. So maybe that's what we're seeing here as well. But it's also just a close look at Southern life and things that African Americans would have had to deal with at this time and in this place. But I don't want to fall too far down a rabbit hole here, but another thing we should notice about this chapter is the weirdly close and often dangerous proximity of whites and blacks. They obviously don't live together in any kind of real sense of the word. There's obviously a ton of segregation, but they inhabit the same general areas. They live, obviously, in relative close proximity to each other. We get the impression that Ralph Jordan has been to Rachel's house quite a bit. He obviously does not live far from there. So that breeds a certain kind of familiarity, and we see it. Obviously, Ralph is very familiar. He acts very familiar with Rachel, calling her by her first name. Again, he's somewhat nice to her, but not quite polite, not quite deferential the way he would be to an elderly white woman. So there was kind of a very specific social code that would have governed the way white men treated elderly slaves who would have been viewed, and again, the portrait we get here, they're religious, they're sort of well-behaved, they're not subversive, they're not rebellious. So there was a certain social code that would dictate a certain level of indulgence or sort of borderline generosity towards slaves like that. But again, it's filled with privilege, right? I mean, Jordan and the white men are in such a superior position. They don't have to say please or thank you. They don't have to ask permission. And they don't even have to worry about the fact that they just ate all the food that was probably in the house. So they give them, some tobacco or whatever, a few crackers, and let's call it even. So we see all of that, but again, there is that familiarity. And we also see that the white men like Aunt Rachel's cooking. And that's not just a throwaway observation. That's significant. We hear them say, oh, give me the food in the slave quarters any day over, the delicacies that you might find in the big house, the plantation house. And, they're kind of just joking and drinking and feeling good. But I think that utterance has a lot of import. And we see it in other ways throughout the narrative. It's kind of this emerging motif where whites kind of use black people for entertainment and amusement in different ways, right? In some ways, in unequal ways, they're sharing sort of a common culture, right? Like the whites like the same kinds of food that the black characters eat. And whites often enjoyed the music that African Americans created, or things like dance, or other sort of artistic expressions, cultural expressions that would later become sort of entrenched in American popular culture. But a lot of them have origins in the slave South. So again, this is kind of a personal hobby horse, so I won't get too far into it, but I just think that we should be able to notice that this trend or this, sort of weird relationship between, whites and blacks in terms of, cultural tastes or practices, it still kind of exists today. And let me try to explain. I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense, but again, we see in historical documents that it would have been very common for white slave owners on Sundays, the day that was traditionally given off to slaves on big plantations. It would have been common for the owners, the slave owning family and their friends on a Sunday to go and observe the African Americans as they sort of had fun and sort of celebrated their day off. So they might have gotten together to play music and prepare a big meal and maybe even put on some dances or some athletic performances or just whatever people like to do for fun. That was their one chance during the week to have some fun. And it was very common. We have documentary evidence that slave owners would go and watch. They would not mingle with the slaves. Obviously, they had to stay separate. They had to stay apart. But the white slave owners would often want to eat that food. They would often want to hear the music. They would want to watch the performances because it was entertainment to them. And they liked the food. They liked the music. They shared some of those cultural tastes, but that did not translate to any kind of political or other forms of social equality. But that's not just a symptom, or that's not just a reality of the 19th century. And I'll try to keep this brief, but if you guys know anything about like the history of rock and roll, or really just popular music in the US, period, whether we're talking about jazz, the blues, or much later hip hop or rap music, all of that sort of had its origin as uniquely African American modes of cultural expression. And those kind of art forms were for a long time kept separate from sort of mainstream white society. But eventually they got mainstreamed. Eventually, the blues became the blueprint for rock and roll. Hip hop or rap music is now considered to be probably the most popular type of music in the US. So there's this weird progression or this development that we can track really throughout our history, particularly if we're thinking about sort of the creation of what we define as American popular culture. A lot of that stuff originally comes from African American artists and populations. And then when white people, the white power structure deems it appropriate, that stuff gets integrated into the mainstream, even if the black artists themselves aren't always integrated in that same way. So a lot of the jazz and blues musicians in the early to mid 20th century that laid the groundwork for almost all American popular music today, they couldn't perform in certain venues. Their records wouldn't get sold in certain stores. They weren't going to get the kind of radio airplay that white artists would get. So there's this, it's weird. And I always think about it specifically in terms of rock music. So just indulge me for a moment and then we'll get back to the book. But if you guys know anything about like sort of the emergence of rock and roll in the 1950s and 1960s, you know that really, rock music was just sort of a charged up, sped up version of blues music that had already existed throughout the US South, for decades. And, a lot of those blues musicians that the British rock bands loved weren't even well known in America. So just if you ever read Keith Richards' autobiography, if you're a Rolling Stones fan, it's a really good read, actually. And Richards talks about the early days of the Stones. And of course, they're all British guys growing up in London. And when they get together to start the band, he says that they're all like teenagers. This is the early 60s. And Richard says that the reason Mick Jagger was so cool to everybody else is because he knew how to get these obscure blues records from African American artists that were not only unknown largely in England, they were unknown in America because of Jim Crow, because of our social system. That music existed, people knew about it, but it wasn't mainstream. It wasn't on the radio. It wasn't played in the respectable white establishments. Now, if you were a white person in the South, You probably knew the blues because you might have even gone and listened to black musicians play. If you lived in a place like the South Side of Chicago, where that music migrated in the early 20th century, maybe you went to black blues clubs. But that could be a little bit of a dangerous proposition for respectable white people. It would have been a bit scandalous to go to those places and to listen to that kind of music. But if you know Elvis Presley's from Mississippi. He talked about going as a kid, going up to Memphis, which was nearby, and sneaking into black blues clubs to listen to these guys because he loved that kind of music. But again, that wasn't really acceptable behavior for normal sort of middle class affluent whites. Elvis was kind of poor. People thought of him as white trash, so nobody really cared what he did. But if you were a middle class white guy, you might have enjoyed that music. You might have indulged in these pastimes, but it kind of had to be kept hidden. It kind of had to be a little bit separate from your normal, respectable persona. So for a lot of white listeners, that music just remained kind of largely unknown, or at least kind of underground. And it was largely these British guys in the 60s who helped to popularize the music by using it as the basis for what, we now call rock and roll. And then by the 70s, there was this kind of blues revival where a lot of these old-time bluesmen like Muddy Waters or Freddie King, guys that had clearly influenced the Stones and Led Zeppelin and Eric Clapton, they started being able to go on tour with some of those guys and playing festivals and actually making some money from their music. But again, there's this weird process where in order for these black blues guys to get paid for their enormous contributions to popular culture, their music had to be legitimized by white people, right? The music had to be legitimized by handsome British white men. And once it became popular in that way, it was sort of safe for the original black practitioners of that music to sort of gain something from their efforts. So I don't know if that really helps us with Blake, but I think something kind of similar is happening here. The food, the music, certain aspects of the culture are enjoyable to white people. And the white people, are going to incorporate those things into their leisure activities, into their frolics or their sprees. But this sort of cultural exchange, or maybe it's just cultural appropriation, that does not lead to, like I said, political or any form of social equality. So this is not transculturation like we might have seen in Cabeza de Vaca, although I know a lot of you were skeptical about whether or not we even saw it there. But here it's just white people taking the parts of black culture that they like and continuing to perpetuate this inequitable system. But there's also this constant latent threat of violence. Even in that scene at Rachel's where everything seems kind of peaceful and good-natured, like I said, there's always that threat. And we later see those same guys, Ralph Jordan and the other guys on the patrol, engaged in this really brutal, sort of reprehensible pastime where the sport is basically hunting black people. And again, Delaney wants us to see that this was just kind of a fact of life. Like, it's not like everybody did it, but it also wasn't uncommon. So I think sometimes it can be hard, to read those passages, obviously, and to sort of accept that these are aspects of American history. But Delaney almost wants to kind of normalize them to a certain extent, to sort of show that these were just staples of slaveholding life. It's not like only uniquely evil men went on frolics and sprees and hunted African Americans and made jokes about it. No, doctors, lawyers, the leading members of society, respectable men, no, they were doing it. And first, before they did it, they would go and eat all the food of some poor slave couple, and then they would go engage in their barbaric pastimes. So it's common. It's commonplace, and it's all the more horrifying for that reason. And again, just before we move on, this might also put us in mind a little bit of Delano and Benito Cereno. And we learned with him that, oh, he likes black people. No, he's not a violent guy. He's not cruel. He likes black people. They amuse him. Remember, he likes to sit in his doorway and watch African Americans back home in Massachusetts. He just likes to watch them. They're great hairdressers, according to the narrator. They're great valets. They're great musicians. White people like that stuff. White people like to use the talents of black people. But that does not mean that white people will give blacks a seat at the table. Right? And that's certainly true with Delano. He regards blacks largely as one would regard a dog. And I know some of us on the discussion post theorized that maybe that's not such an insulting gesture. We can disagree on that. I think it's insulting to compare any person to a dog. I think is to dehumanize that person, even if it's intended as a compliment. Because a dog is not a person. And you might like a dog a lot. And a dog might be man's best friend, but a dog does not get what a person gets. So if we kind of follow that comparison to its logical endpoint, it's always going to be problematic, whether it's delivered in a complimentary fashion or not. But you guys don't have to look at Delano in a negative way, like I said, but just, again, he might have been at home on this frolic. I don't know. Maybe it would have gotten too violent and brutal for him. But certainly the idea of joking around with blacks, watching them or listening to them play music or, dance or engage in athletic pursuits, he would have been game for all of that. He enjoyed all of that. They amused him just like a dog would. So again, this is a common mode of being. It's not unusual. And it doesn't always track as especially brutal and cruel. It's a sort of more subtle form of racism. I think some of you commented on the discussion board that this is the type of racism that I think we're talking more about now. Not the people with the robes on their head burning crosses. That's the obvious kind of racism that we can all see and acknowledge. But now we're starting to uncover these more subtle forms of racism. Oh, I can't be a racist. I like black people. I love their music. That can be problematic. And I think Delano falls into that, and these guys on the patrol definitely fall into that. But another thing that Delaney captures to kind of shift gears here, in addition to sort of these various and often scary cultural sort of collisions between African Americans and whites, we also see some unique cultural characteristics, that are unique to African American characters. So the dialect of the characters, and also the huge presence of Christianity in many of their lives. But you should notice that Henry does not share those traits with most of the other slave characters. He does not speak in dialect, and his view on religion is certainly different from the view of many other of the slave characters. So we see this very specifically in, where did I want to go here? Chapter 6, around page 18 of my edition. But McGann in the critical intro talks about the biblical phrasings that we can often find in the dialogue, in the dialect of the slave characters. Many of the black characters often allude to scripture, and with characters like Daddy Joe and Mammy Judy, a lot of their references to the Bible often emphasize, like trials and tribulations and overcoming. And obviously we can see the reasons for that. And they probably viewed themselves as the wandering Israelites, right? Who are sort of waiting to be led out of slavery. And for them, the oppressors represented by Pharaoh would really be white people. So I think it's worth sort of stopping and thinking for a moment about the slightly different version of Christianity, or at least the different perspective that would exist for this particular community. So the way they're going to read the Bible and the way they're going to read their own sort of presence within this symbolic framework is going to be very different from what white readers would have done. So if you guys remember when we were talking about Puritans and typology, their tendency to view all events as sort of being already predicted by Scripture or having some kind of parallel in Scripture. So for the Puritans, they were the wandering Israelites. They were out there in the wilderness trying to establish a new home. But it's a very different perspective when we look at an enslaved population. And it suddenly becomes a lot more literal, too, for the enslaved population. So they're reading the Bible differently. But Henry rejects this kind of slave interpretation of sort of, mainstream U.S. Christianity. And he labels it as the religion of my oppressors. And he argues that, God can really only be understood through a specifically black interpretation, which is an interesting thing to consider. But if we look at chapter 6, like I said, this is, I think, page 18 in my edition, near the top of the page. So Henry's having an argument with Judy here. I'm not going to attempt to read in her dialect, but I'll just sort of paraphrase in my own words. She's basically asking Henry, in very biblically loaded language, she's asking him, isn't the Lord going to take your feet out of the mire and the clay and give you some kind of hope on the other side of this veil of tears? So again, they're often using a lot of the vocabulary and phrasings that would have come straight from Scripture. So that's what she asks Henry. Again, using this sort of biblical language to make a larger point about just keeping the faith. Don't lose hope. Eventually, you're going to be rewarded. You're going to have your feet taken out of the mire and clay. But then look at Henry's response. He says, I'm tired looking the other side. I want to hope this side of the veil of tears. I want something on this earth as well as a promise of things in another world. So he's no longer content with this promise that the afterlife will kind of make up for your miserable existence during life. And again, that was a reading and an interpretation that we can understand was pretty important for slaves because they didn't have a whole lot to look forward to until the afterlife. He goes on, I and my wife have both been robbed of our liberty, and you want me to be satisfied with a hope of heaven. I won't do any such thing. I have waited long enough on heavenly promises. I'll wait no longer. So again, this is Henry. He's rebellious. He's independent. And he views the kind of Christianity that's been adopted by Mammy Judy as largely coming from the oppressors. Now, again, they have a slightly different angle, a slightly different perspective, but he still rejects it. And on the next page, at the very beginning of chapter 7, the bottom of page 19, he tells us, he's still talking to Judy, I think. He says, I once did believe in religion, but now I have no confidence in it. My faith has been wrecked on the stony hearts of such pretended Christians as Stephen Franks, while passing through the stormy sea of trouble and oppression. And, he gets cut off again, perhaps rightfully so. So that's kind of purple prose, but again, it's very important, I think, for the overall worldview that Delaney is expressing here. And again, we see how Henry is different. Henry is just made of different stuff. He has this independent consciousness, right? So we talked last time about the notion of rebellion or slave insurrection. For a lot of black intellectuals of this time period, it didn't just represent a physical event. Obviously, that is what it is, literally, but it had this kind of figurative or symbolic valence as well, where it kind of represented more like a mindset. Like I was talking about Delaney, he had this idea that, to become sort of empowered and independent and emancipated, there were a series of steps that African Americans needed to complete. And one of those first steps was to make a commitment to personal independence, which I think is kind of hard, frankly, for modern people to really understand. But he's saying that you have to just kind of conceptualize the whole notion of you being a free person. You never have been before. Your parents weren't. Maybe nobody in your sphere is. But you have to wrap your mind around the idea that you could be, that you should be, that you really are an independent person who's just been unfairly placed in bondage. And again, I think a lot of us just take that for granted and we're like, well, yeah, all people think that way. But no, not really. Not if your only experience has ever been bondage, and if you never have really seen a way out, and if you're not literate, and if you've never traveled, and all you have is the religion of your oppressors and your daily, drudgery. So again, and we see that. Not all the slaves that Henry meets want to rebel. Some are like, no, I'm kind of good just sticking with what I'm doing. So there's not always that awakening. There's not always that consciousness of I am an independent person and I will be free no matter what. And Henry's trying to plant those seeds, and he already feels that way, obviously, but it's not a foregone conclusion that everybody will feel that way. And Delaney's larger purpose in writing this, again, that rhetorical purpose, is to help achieve those same ends. For a sort of a theoretical African-American audience that, again, probably didn't exist in a way for this book to really land with an impact when it first came out. But 100 years later, during the civil rights movement of the 20th century, it did have more of an impact. So anyway, I'll kind of try to wrap up quickly here, just kind of going back to the journey. So again, Henry's different. There's a certain messianic sort of quality to him. He's a little bit like a prophet. He's a little bit like the chosen one. And I think we should see his journey in part one as sort of functioning a little bit like the hero's journey. If you guys are familiar with what's his name, Joseph Campbell, and the hero with 1,000 faces, and the whole idea of the hero's journey being sort of handed down from ancient epics, and we see it like in Star Wars and all of these different popular texts. And again, we're kind of seeing it here, right? I mean, I think Henry's definitely going on actually a series of journeys. His trip through the Southeast is really just the first. He undergoes more journeys later. But again, there is this sort of messianic quality to him. And he's sort of trying to spread the word, kind of proselytizing to a certain extent. But he's recruiting in a really practical sense. And you might notice the word Advent shows up over the course of his journeys. And that's an important word, I think. It just means the expectant waiting and preparation for Jesus, both the nativity of Jesus and the second coming of Jesus. So I'm not necessarily saying that Henry is Jesus, but he is a chosen one of sorts. And he is part of, I think, this larger kind of providential plan. God's will, God as nature, providing protective or spiritual care for an oppressed people. Henry might represent that as well. But like I mentioned last week, I'm just really interested in his ethnographic journey through the South. And that begins on chapter 17, and it lasts for about the next 10 chapters, all the way through, I think, chapter 27. So again, he's traveling throughout the South, and he's meeting with different slave populations. And these are sometimes referred to as seclusions, sort of private meetings amongst slaves, away from the watchful eye of the always present white power structure. But McGann, or maybe it's not McGann, but somebody refers, it is McGann, he refers to these as Socratic dialogues. And that just means a sort of cooperative or argumentative dialogue structured around questions and answers and something, designed to sort of stimulate critical thinking. So that's kind of what we see with these meetings between Henry and these various slaves, but we also get something approaching social science. Again, kind of like Cabeza de Vaca, he's sort of doing amateur anthropology. He's recording observations about these different groups of slaves based on different regional characteristics or the different social conditions that he encounters. So this is kind of an anthropological journey. So he goes into the violent backwoods of Arkansas, as we've already seen. He then goes to the Red River region of like northern Louisiana, also kind of the frontier at that time. He later visits Indian Territory, which is the modern day state of Oklahoma. So many of you probably know that that's where a lot of the southeastern Native Americans had been forced to go back in the 1830s as a result of the federal policy of Indian removal. So the 5 major tribes in the Southeast, at the time of white contact at least, Cherokees, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, they were all pretty much forced off their land by the 1830s and made to relocate to what is now Oklahoma. But I think I mentioned that when we were talking about the old Southwestern humor. The reason that stuff finally got opened up for white settlement in the early 1800s is because the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Creek in Alabama and Mississippi had either had their land stolen or bought from them in sort of deceitful land deals, or had just been slaughtered and run off. So that's why those areas were settled later. But by the 1830s, the vast majority of Southeastern Native Americans were gone. And of course, some stayed behind. Some had legally purchased land and they were able to stay, but the majority had been relocated. So he goes out there to Oklahoma. Later, he goes to New Orleans, where he's almost caught. Later, he travels through Georgia, and then he goes to haughty South Carolina. And again, that's my home state. So we mentioned Charleston a little bit last time. I think we need to return to it just briefly here, because he travels to Charleston, and he notices that the slave laws in South Carolina are so restrictive that it would be very, very difficult to foster any kind of insurrection there. And I kind of gave you guys the historical background to that last week. We talked about historical slave insurrections, and of course they happened throughout the South. But there was a particular tradition in the low country of South Carolina near Charleston, and in Charleston, we mentioned Denmark Vesey and his plot back in 1822. There's still dispute over whether or not the rising that he planned was actually violent in nature. It never had a chance to take off. He was arrested, imprisoned, and executed before the rising could happen. But a lot of people think he was really just a community organizer, a free black man who had purchased his own freedom, and a leading member in the AME Church. I mentioned that last week, the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, the first independent black denomination in the U.S. It started in Philadelphia in the early 19th century, but it worked its way down into the South, and Vesey helped to establish it in Charleston. So a lot of historians now think that Vesey wasn't so much an insurrectionist, he was just a community leader, a really powerful organizer and public speaker who the white power structure feared. Because they thought he would have an undue influence on the enslaved population of Charleston, which was massive. As I told you guys, a lot of parts of the South had huge black majorities because of the workforces contained within these plantations, but this was largely an enslaved black population. But of course, the threat of slave rebellion was always there, just beneath the surface. So there's a lot of sort of external mechanisms at work in Charleston that would prevent any kind of organization or any kind of uprising. And again, that's based on real historical fact. And also a thing to remember about Charleston is it was the number one point of entry for slaves entering the U.S. New Orleans was also a big port where that kind of business was done, but Charleston was where the most slaves entered the country. And not that it really matters for this book, but the slave market in Charleston is still there. And it's kind of a tourist attraction now, which is sort of strange. And of course, there's still a very large African American population in Charleston. So it was a very fraught history there. So that might be a little bit of what, and again, because of these restrictive laws and because of this violent history, that might explain the description that Henry uses when he calls it haughty South Carolina. The word haughty basically just means arrogant, right? Arrogantly superior, and somewhat like dismissive or derisive is kind of also the connotation there. So that very much characterizes white society and the sort of brutal nature of the slave regime there. And he also mentions the Brown Society, which is a real thing. So again, we're getting real historical fact here with sort of a light little screen of fictionality thrown over it. But there's a lot of social commentary here. And again, Henry's observing what areas are the most conducive to a slave rebellion. And he realizes that Charleston is not one of those places. So again, he's starting to record a lot of information about these different slave populations. So he determines that, again, according to him, this might make us feel a little icky. He says the most intelligent slaves come from what he calls the old colonial stock of Virginia and Maryland. So that just means that these, they've been their families, right, their lineage has been here in the U.S. for a long time. They were originally in those old seaboard parts of the South, in Maryland, a border state. South Carolina would have been similar. And that old colonial stock, I guess because of their rootedness, because they've been here so long, Blake really privileges them. He thinks that they're kind of the best of the best and they are the best potential allies. But he notices that a lot of that old colonial stock has been moved out to the new part of the South, right? The old Southwest, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas. But those are the best. He decides that the slaves in Arkansas are particularly well organized, and they have to be. Because we've seen there's also very restrictive laws out there, and the whites are very rowdy and kind of, violent just anyway. So in order for the slaves to survive, they have to have really good communication networks and they have to be well organized. But then he doesn't always have such a favorable opinion. When he goes to Kentucky on his way back to Mississippi, he determines that the slaves in Kentucky are too complacent. They don't really want to rebel. And in South Carolina, maybe they want to, but it's just too restrictive. There's no way to make any real moves there. So after he leaves Charleston, he keeps going. He travels up to the Dismal Swamp in North Carolina. That's a real place. It's a gigantic swamp in the eastern part of the state. And there were a lot of Maroons or runaways who lived there. So these were slaves who had escaped years prior in many cases, and they were living in this very remote area, basically as fugitives. Living very much outside of society. So we see this in chapter 24. He goes to the Dismal Swamp before eventually moving on to, I think, Richmond, Virginia, which would later become the capital of the Confederacy. And then he goes to D.C. before kind of heading back home for Mississippi, but he goes a different route and he travels through Kentucky and Tennessee as he continues this sort of ethnographic trip. But I wanted to go back to that scene in the Dismal Swamp in chapter 24 because it's very interesting here. We get some characters that are sort of important in a very unique sort of African American folklore and sort of as McGann calls them, they're kind of quasi-historical figures. So in the Dismal Swamp, Blake encounters these old guys, these maroons or fugitives, who have these connections to older slave rebellions. So we meet characters like Gambi Golar and Maudie Gamas, and these guys are considered like the old heads. They are high conjurers, legendary figures in African American folklore and culture of the time. So like McGann says, they're a part of African American cultural history, even if these particular characters are fictional. Again, he refers to them as quasi-historical. So maybe these guys themselves aren't necessarily real people, but they're based on real people. There were guys like them hiding out in the Dismal Swamp during this time period. It would have been very difficult for those slave patrols to get into the Dismal Swamp and find these guys. So they were able to live there, but again, as fugitives. They had to live their lives that way. So they are important in terms of their cultural significance, and we learn that they are linked to figures like Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, these earlier figures who led rebellions, who led failed slave revolts. So I've already mentioned Turner and his importance historically and in terms of literature. So in 1831, Turner led that insurrection in southeastern Virginia, and I mentioned this last week, but I grossly underestimated the death toll. I had forgotten the scope of it. I thought between 10 and 20 white people were killed in Turner's uprising, but I looked it up. It's actually somewhere around 57 or 58, according to what I read yesterday. So I was way off on that. But that's a particular episode that's clearly informing not only Delaney's work, but also Melville's. And it was pretty fresh in people's mind, even a couple of decades later. So that rebellion led by Turner was eventually suppressed, but not before violence broke out. And Turner, a little bit like Blake, was kind of viewed as a prophet. Or maybe like a messiah, somebody that was thought to have sort of, certain gifts. A skilled orator, a skilled organizer at least, but also viewed by others as possessing a certain kind of spiritual power or other certain like special talents. So, yeah, Blake is somewhat modeled after these characters, not directly. Prosser's another guy in Virginia, led a failed slave rebellion back in the year 1800 near Richmond. Like Vesey, he got stopped really before the whole thing could get underway. But again, these guys in the Dismal Swamp, they are linked to these older rebellions. They're even said to have perhaps fought in the American Revolution, and certainly many African Americans did, both free and enslaved. So they have this really interesting role that they play in American history, both in African American history and just American history writ large. So they're really important links in this bigger chain. But notice that Blake, he thinks that their day has kind of passed, right? He thinks that their usefulness has kind of expired. But he still recognizes that getting the seal of approval from these guys is important when it comes to his own credibility. So in chapter 27, when he returns to the Franks plantation, and he's talking to his friends, Andy and Charles, he tells them, hey, I don't necessarily believe in this stuff, but by getting their approval, by getting the old heads' approval, he says, this will help me, with the more ignorant slaves. It will cause them to have more confidence in me and more respect, for me and the other leaders of the movement. So he knows that it will give him credibility to meet with these guys, to talk to these guys, to get sort of legitimized by these guys. But he doesn't view himself as being superstitious in the same way that they are. This belief in sort of conjuring and their powers. He's not necessarily buying it, but he recognizes that they have cultural importance and they're kind of authorities on the topic of rebellions because they've participated in them. Perhaps that's what made them fugitives in the first place. So there's some real history here, but it's also folklore. It's also kind of a mythology that's, again, kind of uniquely African American. White readers wouldn't have really known about these kind of guys in the Dismal Swamp with this kind of a history. This was a uniquely African American cultural tradition that now, we can see as perhaps being more widely known. But I want us to think a little bit about Henry as we wrap up. We have to kind of acknowledge that he seems to have scorn for a lot of the other slaves. He has a little bit of a superior attitude. Perhaps we think that's warranted. One thing to consider, and I've already mentioned this, he was not born into slavery. Apparently he was free-born in the Caribbean, I think. Now, he was decoyed as a young man into slavery, and that was a common practice. Again, one of these things that Delaney mentions and sheds light on that wouldn't have been commonly known necessarily by a wide white audience. But decoying was a pretty familiar practice in which free-born, free African Americans would be tricked or deceived into being sold into slavery. If you guys have ever seen 12 Years a Slave or read the 1853 memoir by Solomon Northup that it was based on, that's exactly what happens to Northup. He was a free African American. I think he was from New York, maybe, like upstate New York. He was like a professional violinist, very much not a slave and had never been a slave, I don't think. Maybe he was born into slavery, I can't remember, but he was certainly a free man, a professional musician, but he gets decoyed while in Washington, D.C., if I'm remembering the story. He gets decoyed and sold into slavery in the Deep South, and he ends up as a slave on a plantation in Louisiana. So that memoir came out about 6 years before Delaney started writing Blake. And remember, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in, I think, 1852 or 1853. 12 Years a Slave comes out in 1853. And then Blake begins to be published in 1859. So all of this stuff, it's all happening at around the same time. These representations, these depictions of slavery, they are starting to break in to the popular consciousness by the 1850s. And it's not a coincidence that the Civil War follows hard on their heels. Again, Blake didn't have a big readership, but you better believe Uncle Tom's Cabin did. So all of this is happening around the same period of time. So, yeah, we mentioned these slave uprisings. Just a quick mention on Nat Turner. If you guys are interested, Delaney does mention Turner a few times. Again, he might sort of be an inspiration for Henry on some levels. The thing to note about Turner is he continues to pop up in fiction. He continues to show up in literature. And that began in 1831, the very year of his insurrection. That same year, there was a book called The Confessions of Nat Turner, written by Thomas Gray, this white sort of hack writer from Virginia. I think he was a journalist, but he claimed to have visited Turner while Turner was in jail awaiting execution. Gray goes and basically interviews him and writes down Turner's account of the insurrection. The veracity of Gray's book has been doubted in the years since, as you can imagine, but that was just the first of many, many different novels written about Nat Turner. The most famous was from the late 60s. written by William Styron. You guys might know him. He's a pretty famous American author. He's dead now, but he wrote Sophie's Choice, and he also wrote The Confessions of Nat Turner, the same title as Gray's version. Styron's is quite a bit better, but also kind of controversial from our modern perspective. This is, of course, a white man writing the book from Turner's perspective. And according to Styron, one of Turner's big motivators was a very sexually charged love for the white mistress of the family that owned him. And I don't really think we have any historical evidence that that was a part of it. That just made for good melodrama, I think. And that's why Styron did it. And again, Styron wrote the book in the 60s. It was an award winner at the time. It won the Pulitzer, I think, in 68. It's one of my dad's favorite books, but it's one of those books that now we kind of reevaluate it. Styron's a very good writer, but I think we kind of question his maybe his whole, pursuit in writing that book. Or I think there's a debate now as to whether or not that's even a story for somebody like him to tell. But in the 60s, those questions didn't always get asked in the same way, at least not in the same public way. So anyway, Nat Turner lives on in the popular imagination. There was even a movie, I did not see it, it came out a few years ago, another depiction of Nat Turner, at least loosely based on Turner's life and the insurrection that he led. All right, so yeah, just quickly on Henry, what do we think about him? Is he compelling? Is he sympathetic? Clearly he's independent. We know that. He has his own consciousness. We know that. But again, if we're thinking about Delany as novelist, we might notice that he doesn't necessarily create the most three-dimensional character portraits. Blake is a little bit of a one-note guy. He's very righteous, he's very brave, he's very intrepid, and that's maybe kind of all he is. I think a lot of Delany's characters are kind of stand-ins. They represent bigger things. They might not always work great on their own as literary characters. But again, his eye for detail is great. And a lot of Henry's adventures allow us, the readers, to learn a lot culturally, like I've been saying. But Henry as a character, we might not all find him to be super interesting. But just a final thought on him, going back to Uncle Tom's Cabin, is fine if you've never read it. It doesn't get assigned much anymore. It used to be something that all American students would have read, but not anymore. One thing to note is, again, it's an example of sentimental literature, as we've discussed. So, as such, the character of Tom, this elderly, kind black man, and yes, that is where the derogatory term Uncle Tom comes from. On his deathbed, the character of Tom, he has this sort of vision of the white girl that he used to sort of have a affection for back when he worked for this white family or whatever. The dead white girl that he used to be friends with. And again, it kind of underscores Tom's loyalty and love of good white people. And that kind of makes us feel differently now, I think, than it did back then. But remember, sentimental lit, it's supposed to make us feel strong emotions. It's supposed to make us feel sympathy for the characters, but it's also supposed to kind of model proper moral behavior and conduct, right? So that's very much what Stowe is trying to do, but I also kind of think it's what Delany's trying to do. So I wouldn't really call this book a sentimental novel because it's too many other things to be comfortably housed under that category. But I think Delany wants to model moral conduct. Blake is a great model for moral conduct, and there is moral instruction here in Blake, because like McGann says, there's kind of a didactic function here. This book is supposed to be teaching us something. It's supposed to be teaching us about a new consciousness, emancipation, and the best way to achieve it. So, it's not fundamentally different from the sentimental fiction sort of template, but I think Delaney's doing things quite a bit different. And one way we can see that is by looking at Henry, and Henry is definitely not a typical sentimental character like Tom is, right? So Tom is meant to represent sort of Christian values, basic decency, loyalty, love, whatever. Well, Blake represents a lot of positive qualities too, but he's not here just to do that. He's not here to express his loyalty and undying love for white people. He's not interested in that. And yeah, he might be spiritual or religious, but it's not the white person religion. He's not subscribing to white people's culture, society, or religion. He wants an African American consciousness, and he wants to invest in African American religion, African American culture, and an African American society. So he's not functioning like a traditional sentimental character. The way that Stowe's characters would have acted, the way Rowson or Foster's characters would have acted. He's on to something different here. He's doing a lot of different things. And like we said, this is part one's kind of a mashup. A lot of it does feel like a pretty traditional novel. In a lot of ways, we have a lot of the elements that we would expect to find in a novel, but he also mixes in some social commentary, a little bit of ethnography, as we were saying, some elements of sentimental fiction, and we also see the hero's journey or the quest narrative, which is, of course, very common in our popular culture and really all of Western popular culture as well. It gets handed down from the ancient epics of, ancient Greece, largely, although other cultures had their epics too. So again, there's lots of journeys here, not just the journey Henry takes through the Southeast. Later in part one, he and his compatriots will undertake the familiar Underground Railroad journey north to Canada. And then in part two, we have a whole different journey. So we'll stop there for now. And next week, we'll finish up part two of the novel. And like I said, we'll also talk about Circumstance by Harriet Spofford. And then I'll briefly wrap up by talking about the final exam. So please get in touch with me. It is that time of the semester. Things are due soon. So if you have questions or concerns, let's talk either through email or I can set up a video conference. Okay. So have a great week, and I'll see you next week for our final lecture of the semester.